Welcome back to Horrifying Stories. Doug Scott was an esteemed high-altitude mountaineer who was first known as one of the first British mountaineers to climb the southwest face of Mount Everest. Only 2 years after his successful attempt at Mount Everest, he ventured into another challenging feat, climbing the 7,285-meter high mountain called the Ogre. He and his friends had just descended from the summit when he got slammed onto the rock wall of the mountain and caught himself hanging around 7,200 meters above sea level with 2 broken legs. This is his horrifying story. Viewer discretion is advised. Being the first ones to have conquered the southwest face of Mount Everest in 1975, together with Dougal Haston, Doug Scott was a widely known name among mountaineers. He gained popularity most especially in Britain, where he earned the title, the first Briton to ever climb the world's tallest mountain. Doug's passion for mountaineering was remarkable and extraordinary. Unlike other hikers who fixed their eyes on the prize of conquering the summit, Doug had this inexplicable love for the whole journey to the summit and back, much more than reaching the summit itself. Thus, not long after his Mount Everest record, just 2 years after, in 1977, Doug Scott began his first attempt to climb Bintab Rock Mountain, otherwise known as the Ogre. This mountain summit stands 7,285 meters above sea level. To get to the Ogre, Doug, together with 5 other friends, boarded a plane to Kabul and headed on to Pakistan. As soon as they reached Pakistan, they hired persons with disabilities who generally had a hard time looking for jobs to ensure their loyalty. After all, they needed locals whom they can rely on as they attempt to conquer new heights. What makes the Ogre different from the rest was that it featured huge and wide rock walls that positioned almost at a 90-degree angle. At such a sharp drop, snow could not even accumulate on these rocks and just easily slide off despite being in a snowy area, making it a haven for rock climbers. Their hike up the Ogre covered 2 different phases. One is the south pillar and the other the southwest flank. The south pillar was more challenging as it was a vertical granite cliff that was 1,000 meters high, while the route to southwest flank was composed of ridges and snowfields. The southwest flank was still a very challenging climb, but compared to the south pillar was a bit more manageable. It was Doug Scott and Paul Braithwaite who attempted to take on the south pillar, while the rest of the team went for the southwest flank. The 4-man team included Chris Bonington, who was also previously a part of the Everest team with Doug, Nick Estcourt, Clive Rowland, and Mo Antoine. Doug and Paul started their climb to the south pillar. They had just covered a few meters in their climb when a rock fell and hit Paul, leaving him injured. This prompted them not to push through with their south pillar climb and retreat to the base camp. The 4-man team, on the other hand, set up camp at the 6,100-meter elevation mark. Then, Chris and Nick went for the west summit in a quick ascent, bringing with them food supplies that could last them up to 5 days. After their separate adventures, the 6 hikers all met back at the base camp a few days later. Doug, along with Chris, Clive, and Mo, decided to go on a second attempt to the west summit. Nick and Paul opted to pass and just stay at the base camp. At the 7,000-meter mark, just beyond the west summit, the 4 hikers set up camp by making a snow cave. From there, Doug and Chris then went for the main summit, which was 250 meters high. Climbing there required technical skills due to its difficulty. For Doug specifically, in his hiking experience, it was the most technical climb at such a high altitude. It was July 13, 1977. The sun was about to set when they arrived at the main summit. As soon as they reached the peak, they immediately started their descent and opted to rappel going down, as not to waste any more time before it gets too dark. However, as they were rappelling down the cliff, Doug slipped as he unexpectedly kicked on melted snow, lost control, and got slammed onto the rock wall. He extended his left leg and tried to kick the wall so he could bounce back and regain control, but he felt a sudden and excruciating pain as his leg touched the wall. The pain from his foot went all the way to his groin. He then tried to kick through his right leg, and the pain was as excruciating as the first one. It was then that Doug realized his precious legs, both his lower legs, had been broken. They had just started going down from the main summit, and their base camp was still around 2,000 meters away. What kept running through Dog's mind was how to get back to the base camp with both legs broken. But his mind was set that no matter what and how that would happen, he knew he would make it happen since Chris, Mo, and Clive were there to help him. So he focused on 100 meters at a time. Because it was his lower legs that got broken, he decided to use his knees to push himself away from the rock wall as he rappelled down the cliff alongside with Chris. Needless to say, this slowed them down. They were only 250 meters away from their snow cave, but they had to stop and get some rest on a ledge. They camped out in the open that night before continuing their rappel down the next morning. When they arrived at the snow cave, they regrouped with Clive and Mo and decided to stay there for the night to get a good rest. That night, they ate the last food supply they had left. The group of 4 hikers still had a long way ahead of them. To get to the base camp, they still had to climb and pass through the west summit, then along the area where they had previously set up camp at around 6,000 meters before they could even reach the base camp. The next day, they were greeted by a blizzard, so they decided to stay one more night in the snow cave before making their way down. When they got back on the track, Dog crawled on the ground so he could move forward, as his 3 friends also tried to support him in every way possible. From the west summit, the 4 hikers rappelled, going down to 6,100 meters where they initially set up camp. Then, without delay, they set out on their journey back to base camp. As they were descending, Chris fell and fractured 2 of his ribs, thus making matters worse. Shortly after, Chris has started to cough non-stop. Worried that it would lead to something more critical such as pulmonary edema, Chris got anxious. However, despite his condition, Dog calmly brushed it off and tried to uplift Chris and get him to focus on how they could get out of their situation. After a brief stop, now with 2 of them injured, they gathered themselves together and proceeded on with their journey, slowly but surely. At this point, Dog has already gotten used to crawling. There were times that it was Dog who paved the way for the team and created a trail ahead of them as he realized it was much easier to crawl on fresh and thick snow. The last stretch of their hike back to base camp involved 4 miles of rocks, sediments, and melted snow. Dog had no other choice. This was the only way going back to base camp, so he had to endure the rough and hard path. Dog had to wear 4 layers of clothing to somehow make the pain of crawling through the rocks more bearable. Despite having thick layers of clothing, still, Dog's knees were not spared from swelling and bleeding. When Mo reached the base camp, ahead of the 3 other hikers, he discovered that Nick and Paul had already gone ahead. The 2 have been waiting for the past 7 days for their return, and because it had been longer than expected, they thought that something might have already happened to their friends and that they may never come back anymore. Thus, the 2 decided to go home and just left a note just in case their hunch was wrong. Upon reading their note, Mo decided to follow after them, hoping he can still catch up with them. He also left a note for his 3 friends to let them know he will try to catch up with Nick and Paul and of course to seek help for the 3 of them. 5 days later, help indeed finally arrived at the base camp where Dog, Chris, and Clive had been waiting. Locals who were experienced porters arrived to rescue Dog and his friends. 12 porters carried Dog in an improvised stretcher using sleeping mat and tree branches made into poles. They traversed the Biafo Glacier for 3 days until they got to an area where the rescue helicopter could land. Dog knew and trusted the locals very well, despite such a challenging task of carrying him to safety. Previously, he personally saw how one of the porters was able to bring their things that weighed around 66 pounds along with 31 eggs across the challenging trail of Biafo Glacier to base camp. In that 12-mile stretch, not one egg cracked, so Dog was confident with his rescuers. He just lied down and watched them with overwhelming appreciation for the teamwork and skills they have displayed. As they boarded the helicopter, great relief overtook them since they were now on their way to getting the medical help that they needed. Tragically, in an unexpected turn of events, the helicopter crash-landed from a height of 6 meters as they were approaching Skardu due to engine failure. Although this caused further delay, thankfully, no further injuries were obtained, and both Dog as well as Chris got the medical attention they both needed. The horrifying ordeal did not discourage Dog from his passion. He continued to climb and conquer many notable challenging summits. Doug lived to tell his story of survival and persistence many years after, through speaking engagements and in the book entitled The Ogre, which was released last 2017. The book was a biography of Doug's close call with death during his climb at the third highest mountain in the world, authored by Doug himself. Sadly, Doug Scott died in 2020 at the age of 79 due to cerebral lymphoma, but even during his last days, even though his body got weaker and weaker, his passion for climbing was as strong as ever. Thank you for making it this far. If you liked this video, please don't forget to click the like and subscribe button to get updated. For more of these climbing incidents, check out the video on the left. And for other horrifying stories, click the other video. We appreciate your support. Once again, thank you and we'll see you on the next one.